I awoke in a small structure with a dome-shaped ceiling that glowed with what I guessed was outside light. This subdued light provided an evenly lit environment within. I peered through a square hole at the sky above me. A small fire blazed in the middle of the room. At first I thought I was back in the aft hold on the Nar. Then I remembered my rescue and the trek across the frozen land. A wrinkle-faced female rubbed her rough palm across my face and forehead. She put her hand behind my head and simultaneously touched a steaming cup of broth to my lips. I hesitantly opened my mouth and she tipped the cup. A pungent taste and an astringent pine smell invaded my senses. The smell of the concoction made me queasy, but at my slightest hesitation she scowled. I decided to submit to her treatment and drank the foul potion, but I had no sooner swallowed it before I vomited it up again. She used a piece of my robes to wipe my mouth and chin. Undaunted by my protest, she fed me more of the drink, only moving the cup away when the hot liquid overflowed my mouth and ran down my cheeks. I finally raised my hand, hopefully signaling no more. She hesitated, shook her head at me, then slowly lowered my head. Within the next few moments, my escort entered the structure through a snow-sheathed tunnel. The thought that this entire structure was made of ice and snow fascinated me. The dome ceiling was reminiscent of the domes of the great cathedrals in Europe, and, as I was later told, could withstand violent winter storms. More and more these people impressed me over and over again. They demonstrated creative intelligence that was on par with the so-called civilized societies of the world. He smiled at me and I managed a weak smile back. I instinctively put my hand to my chest and said, "Thank you. It was for saving my life." I didn't know whether he was capable of understanding my gesture, but I wanted to do it anyway. "Kiangahalak tagilusi," he replied, directing the Thule words at me. I no longer felt like I was the third person. I took this as a version of "you're welcome," if not the actual words. It was as if the words were a charm or an incantation that improved my spirit as well as my vitality. I took this as a good sign. I knew that these people were wise and would help me to return to my previous state of health. I slowly lifted my hand to the center of my chest and said, "Ari, Ari, Kalunat, Ari," he said, pointing at me. The female laughed, displaying a toothless smile. I didn't understand the first part of the name he repeated back to me, but when I heard him include my name, I felt that we were making progress. "Taliriktug," he said, hitting his chest with a closed hand. I repeated his name several times to get the sound. Each time he nodded and smiled. Taliriktug turned to the woman and said something to her. She nodded hesitantly and then looked at me. She pushed on my forehead, indicating that I should lie down. She ran her hand down over my face. I took this to mean that she thought I could do with more sleep. I did what I was told and went back to sleep, with the sound of activity receding further and further from my thoughts. Some time later, I felt my body being shaken. I opened my eyes to see Taliriktug standing over me, smiling. He helped me to sit up on my fur covers and supported me while I balanced myself. I was a little dizzy, but I felt much better. Taliriktug put a cup in my hand containing the same pine-smelling broth that the old woman had given me. I trusted that these people knew what they were doing and drank the hot liquid regardless of its foul taste. Taliriktug began talking, gesturing with his hands. He pointed at the current position of the sun and followed its future path across the sky. From what I could gather, he wanted us to continue our journey. This was how I interpreted him, resting his elbow on the palm of his other hand and moving his arm in an arc from left to right. Then by walking his first and second fingers across his palm, I understood that we were to go to another place, perhaps a camp, and that he wanted to get there before nightfall. I nodded, indicating that I understood him, and I tried to mentally prepare myself for a day of traveling. He sat next to me and we began eating. Taliriktug had a different kind of meat with him. It looked fresh. He tore a piece off with a bone knife and handed it to me. Rather than put it in my mouth, I placed it on the stone side of the hearth. Taliriktug watched with interest as the meat began to smoke. He followed my example and put his piece of meat on the stone edge of the hearth as well. In about a minute or so, the bite-sized morsel looked like it was cooked most of the way through. I carefully picked it up and put it into my mouth. I relished the hot food, the flavor and the cooked texture of the meat. Whatever he'd given me had an unusual fishy beef taste. Taliriktug picked up his meat and began chewing it. Immediately his eyes squinted and his lips twisted and puckered. He spit the morsel into the fire. He immediately put another piece of raw meat into his mouth, presumably to cover up the foul taste of the cooked meat. We took turns eating our individually prepared meat until all that was left was the bone. To my surprise and shock, Taliriktug broke the bone in two and began sucking the inside of it. He picked up a rock and hit the bone, splintering the remaining halves. As before, he sucked the splinters of bone and discarded them when he'd drawn out all of the marrow. We dressed in our outer clothing and headed toward the exit. Taliriktug picked up a pack that was propped against the tunneled entrance and led the way through it. The tunnel curved downward and then back up again. I felt and heard the blowing wind as I crawled upward. I fully realized the ingenuity behind the design of this structure. The living space was underground and somehow the ice and the cold snow insulated the occupants from the elements. I crawled out and squinted at the sunny morning. The wind slapped my face and my nostrils felt like they were closing in on themselves as I took my first breath of frigid morning air. Hearing movement behind me, I turned around to see a pack of wolves watching us. I jumped and was about to run away when Taliriktug indicated to me that it was all right. It was then that I noticed that the animals were tied to a sled. I had heard of these beasts whose primary use was transportation, but this was the first time I had seen one, let alone a pack of them. They sat staring back at me, some with their tongues hanging out, the steam of their breath visible in the sunshine as it dissipated in the cold air. Taliriktug indicated to me that we were to take his sled across the frozen land and through the mountains. I didn't know where or if we were supposed to meet someone, so I abandoned myself to his will. He picked up a whip and gestured for me to board the sled, while he stood on the two back skis. I sat down on top of some supply packs in a compartment at the front of the sled. The dogs stirred and formed a line in front of us. I heard the spinning of the whip as it sheared through the air, then an echoing crack as it snapped in midair. The dogs bolted across the ice. I clutched the sled as it jerked and stuttered. I could feel the blood rushing from my knuckles. The sled's skis skimmed across the packed snow, and we quickly picked up speed as we crossed the field. From what I could interpret, our destination was on the coast of what I now understood to be an island. I didn't know whether he was taking me to an island across the ocean, or whether we were on an island. He was taking me to see people, or a person, or perhaps it was on a mountain, or maybe both. His language was intimidating, unlike anything I had encountered before. During our journey, Taliriktug taught me some other words using hand gestures. I didn't fully understand the meaning of some, but later when some of them were used in context, I was able to understand them and combine them in a very rudimentary way. His people are an ancient race. Several groups, he told me, had crossed a large body of water to arrive on this land. Other groups of his people had separated and traveled to various other lands. Some unknown enemy had wiped out some, but enough survived to establish communities along the coast of this land. Some went even deeper inland, but all remained linked by a complex, interconnected trading relationship. He told me about a man that I guessed was a leader, or someone of importance in the community. I didn't understand all the words he used to describe him, but I did know he was different from Taliriktug's people, and eventually I figured out that I was being taken to him. Taliriktug compared the man to the walrus, an important animal to his people. I knew that they used this water creature for many things and depended upon it for survival. I was fascinated to learn that Taliriktug's family was spread out across the land. Despite their movements, they all managed to meet and stayed in contact with one another by passing messages from group to group. Trading and information and sometimes gossip kept them linked and prosperous. If one Thule had two walruses, for example, and the other family's travels would not take them close to a pack of them, then a walrus would be traded for some other food, perhaps a caribou. and in extreme cases, they traded items on credit. This was curious to me because I could not understand why they didn't fight among themselves for the limited resources of this frozen land. Taliriktug explained to me that his people had never fought with one another. At some time in their history, they had escaped to this land from a place of warring peoples. He didn't know how long ago this happened, but he did say that his father's father told of having to move several times to escape various aggressors. He explained that their experiences as a people favored working as part of a larger family. They all benefited from this type of existence. I looked at our route ahead and thought how deceptive this land was. Hidden beneath the surface was an abundance that I hadn't seen before. The waters underneath the frozen sheet teemed with life. On the land, caribou ran, wolves hunted, and the snow and ice camouflaged the white bears of the northern. Where I once saw scarcity, I now witnessed life and resourcefulness. To me, scarcity had more to do with how the resources were used rather than the amount in existence. It only existed in the mind. We rested for a while at the base of a dizzyingly colossal mountain. Taliriktug threw raw meat into the center of the pack of dogs. The pack leader ate first, while the other dogs watched. Once he'd walked away from the food, the others in the pack ate what was left. Occasionally, growls and bared fangs threatened to erupt into fights, but more often than not, jaws snapped in the air, and one beast backed down. Taliriktug pointed up the mountain pass. "Angakuk! Angakuk!" he yelled. I took this as the direction we would be going. I was to later find out that it meant wise person. At the time, I thought he was speaking of his god. Our route would take us up along a narrow path compared to the openness of the ice field. I looked up and wondered how we were to ascend the mountain. The path seemed to rise straight up. I couldn't imagine the dogs pulling the weight of 2 grown men, our supplies, and the sled up the path that lay before us. Taliriktug indicated to me that our break was over. It was time to leave. He roused the dogs and directed me to climb aboard the sled. Rather than climbing back onto the sled himself, he walked ahead of the dogs, leading them and sometimes pulling them up the mountainside. I could tell that the climb was laborious for the dogs. Not only did they have to deal with the weight of the sled and me, but the blowing snow settled, then froze on their snouts and over their eyes. The snow surface of the path was firmly packed, indicating frequent travel, but when the dogs encountered drifts, they had to jump forward with each step as they sank into the snow, and whenever they slowed, the sled snapped backward. We took frequent breaks to allow the dogs to rest. I looked to my left. Rising over that side of the pass was another mountain, barren of snow. Its rock base was almost vertical, preventing snow from accumulating on it or at its pinnacle. On the lower 2/3 of the mountain, its flank remained in shadow, but on the last third, the sun reflected off the minerals veining the rock face. I looked to the surface of the pass and saw indications that this place was alive with life. Deer and wolf tracks occupied the same path. Even blood dotted the white trail, and if the eye followed far enough, it encountered a bloody half-eaten carcass. The dogs sniffed the frozen carcass but didn't stop. I lay back, resting my head on the stacked packs, and stared up at the sky. Swaths of clouds chased the light across the atmosphere, as if Frey had painted them with one stroke. I remained mesmerized despite the uncomfortable cold and discomfort of the journey.